Zenglop the Podcast. Conversations with an Aesthetic Alien. A podcast where we talk about music, poetry, and psychogeography. So I'm recording the podcast a little bit earlier in the week because I'm going to be traveling over the weekend. I wanted to make sure I get something up and published. I'm going to New York for the weekend. So this is kind of cool. Check this out. The plan was that my father and I were going to meet and on Saturday catch a performance of Parsifal, Wagner's opera Parsifal at the Met. And it happens to be a Saturday matinee, which I think means it starts at 11, even allowing for the length of a Wagner opera. It's done by mid-afternoon. I think it's done by 4. So that was all good. And then my dad pointed out that down the street that evening, the New York Philharmonic was doing a concert performance of the first act of Valkyrie, I think. I might have that wrong, but the first act of one of the operas from The Ring. It's got to be Valkyrie. And why don't we try and do both? So we are doing both. We're listening to Parsifal in the morning, afternoon, and then taking a break, and then catching a concert performance. A concert performance means that everything is done, all the music and all the singing is done, but there's no staging. So the singers are on the stage with the orchestra, and they sing along, but there's no staging. There's no acting, or whatever you call it, in a Wagner opera when they gesticulate. So then, looking to see, getting up there, I'm actually taking the train up on Friday. I'm going to get on a train here in Pittsburgh at about 7 in the morning, and then it gets in to New York mid-afternoon, 3 or 4 o'clock, something like that. It's a good long train ride. And we realized that Friday evening, Philip Glass is giving a recital of his solo piano works. So why not do that too? So it should be a wonderful weekend. I'm really looking forward to it. Last year, or was it maybe the year before, my dad and I went to see the whole Ring cycle. The Kennedy Center down in Washington, D.C. did a Ring festival. So I went down there for the week. There were performances Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. And on the Wednesday was a break where there were some seminars, actually some really interesting workshops or seminars where the singers talked about the performance and the festival. That's where I picked up that Wagnerian singers really do live in a different world, and you move through roles as your career develops and as you mature and as your voice changes. And it was interesting to hear them talk about that, how the bass role will move from a giant Fafner, and then move through the different bass roles. The same with the tenors, how once you've moved to do Siegfried in Wagner, you never do anything else again. You could never go back. If you had the voice to do Mozart or Italian opera, once you start singing Siegfried, you're set. So just very interesting to hear. And they all know each other, of course, because at that level, there's only a couple of people at any given time who can do any of those roles. So it was good to hear them talk. And I was floored. I had no baseline. I had no expectations. I mean, I like Wagner. I've seen a couple of the operas independently, and I knew that the Ring was done in this 5-day cycle, but I was totally unprepared for how powerful the end of Götterdämmerung was, with this scene where Brunhilde throws herself into the fire that's been lit by the broken world staff to burn Valhalla down. And she sings of love, and there's this sweeping romantic theme that comes in that is played only rarely through the whole previous 20 hours of music. I was transfixed. The expression like not being able to breathe, that was exactly how I felt. I think for the last 45 minutes, I just was like I had my finger stuck in an electric outlet. I can see why people travel around the world or the country looking to find performances of the festival of the Ring Cycle, kind of like groupies. It was unlike anything I'd experienced either musically or any other way. So that was great, and I've seen Parsifal once before, also down in DC at a time when Placido Domingo was the director, and also the lead. He sang Parsifal when I saw it. So I have no idea who is conducting or performing this weekend, but I am sure it will be wonderful. I'm also looking forward to do the train ride out there. It is something like a 9 or 11 hour train ride. There's a bit of a layover in Philadelphia. But I'm taking my laptop and the crappy draft of my essays, and I'm going to use the time to just work through more of that. I really need to break through this block I have about looking at. I'm looking at it right now as a stack of papers. It's 160 pages. It's about 65,000 words. Half of it's probably crap. There's still a lot of sections where I just write a note to myself that says, do this. And I need to get beyond that. I need to feel like I am taking small sections and refining them to the point where they are ready to go. And I feel like once I've gotten a handle around the larger scale, I'll be able to work on those smaller pieces and refine them. But right now I'm just seeing this big pile of crap. And so I'm thinking the train ride out, the train ride back, if I set aside, even if it's 20 minutes every hour, and just poke at it and gradually, build up some consistency. So I'm going to do that. I'm also going to bring my Heidegger with me because I've been reading Being in Time. And when I say reading, I mean reading that I have the book and I've opened the book. I've read some essays about Being in Time, and I've had a long conversation with a friend of mine about Heidegger over the last decade. But I've never actually read all of Being in Time, so I'm going to bring that. And I think between the ride out and the ride back, I will read through the introduction. I've read the introduction once before, but it was a few years ago, and I didn't understand a word of it. But I have since done a bit more secondary study around Heidegger, and I think if I go through it, I should be able to extract some key points. And then on a weekly basis, take some time, maybe on a Sunday morning, and just read through a section. But I think, again, like with the essays, I just need to get over this initial framing, like get used to it, jump in, just dive right in, and then see what happens. I have no timeline to finish reading it, the same way I don't really have a timeline to finish these essays, but I do need to be working on them. So, all right, so that's the trip. A couple other things to talk through. Go check out my YouTube channel. It is that is taking shape. I've kind of crossed over a hump with that. I've been putting at least one video a week. The Urban Bellabogue series now has 4 episodes, so that's where I take my very low frequency recorder and go to various locations different place each week, take a little video, make some recordings of the electromagnetic activity in that space, and then put together a little 10-minute video on what it was, me and the place and the sound. So last week I was at the Highland Park Reservoir, and it was pretty striking. It was very foggy. It was kind of an icy day, and it was interesting because even just being a little bit removed from a main street, although the electromagnetic hum was really present, it wasn't an all-encompassing wall of sound. I actually think that on a couple of occasions you can hear what are real spherics, right, which is that atmospheric disturbance that can make chirping sounds. If you're really in a place that's away from other sources of electromagnetic activity, you can hear all kinds of a chorus of chirping and squawking sounds. That's really very startling to hear. But because there's so much interference here, you just can't hear them. Except there's a jetty that goes out to the middle of the reservoir. So maybe I'm 100 yards away from a main power line, certainly not very far. You still hear that as a hum, but you can also hear some little static sounds, which I think are spheric. So go check that out. There's also, around that, in addition to that, I'm also putting up some videos, a series of studies with the piano and different electronics. So I did one a few weeks ago. It was piano and sine wave, just playing a sine wave into the piano and then recording the different overtones and resonance that comes out of that. And then most recently, I just took the record, the microphone, the mic'd piano into a ring modulator, and then played around with that with the output. So sort of, again, explored some different gestures at the keyboard to see what they sounded like with ring mod. And then in the end, played a section of an arrangement of Mahler's Second Symphony, the Ehrlicht movement, which sounds very colorful and this bizarre, beautiful halo caused by the ring modulation of me playing. So go check that out. On YouTube, you can search for Zenglop, you can search for the Urban Bellbook, and I'll also put a link. Just to wrap up that part, you can also go to zenglop.net, because I've started to be a bit more diligent about updating that with the links to these podcast episodes, but also a link directly to the videos. In fact, go to zenglop.net. It's the easiest way to catch up on everything that's going on. Right, so that took a bit longer than I thought. So I mentioned the secondary reading of Heidegger and this idea of getting over a hump. And there's a better way of putting that. It's more like the creative application of learning. And when I was looking at all of this new modular synthesis stuff, I realized that the way that I was approaching it was to simply observe and absorb everything. YouTube videos, essays, reviews, material that I didn't even necessarily understand, but that was being presented on the subject. And over the course of a couple of weeks, I would watch a video about some very technical aspect of Eurorack modular synthesis, patching or something, and I would have no idea how it worked. But I would then have a question, and I would find something that was maybe a more basic introduction or just something completely different that made a reference to that initial subject, and the question was answered. And I found that simply by immersing myself, I absorbed a lot of information to the point where I'm quite comfortable now making decisions about how I'm going to invest some money in a Eurorack system myself. The same with Heidegger. I don't understand a bloody word that he says. I don't really understand most of what people write when they write about Heidegger. But I feel like this full-on immersion in the material will settle down and fall into a place that makes sense for me, that may be right or wrong. What if, it may be an idiosyncratic is a better word than right or wrong. It may be an idiosyncratic position to understand Heidegger, but it will be one that makes sense for me. So I'm thinking about how I learn and how I absorb information and where that information comes from and how much of it is available. And I'm very aware of this because I'm also looking to practice the game of Go, which, like Heidegger, is something that's been part of my life, part of a friendship that I have, but I've never studied properly. And now I want to. And I'm applying deliberately that same sense. I'm looking at lectures and videos on YouTube that are quite advanced and far beyond my playing ability. But I feel like immersion in the material, even if it's material I don't understand, forms an idiosyncratic understanding that will then turn into the way that I play the game. I'm also working through some books that are structured for beginners. And again, these lectures that I listen to will raise a question, and then I might find the answer in the beginner's book. But it seems more satisfying to have that connection rather than to just move methodically from start to end, or through the kind of standard progression. But what I'm starting to do now, there's two things. First, I play on an app on my phone that has a computer I can play against, and also other people that I can play against remotely. But I have a habit of throwing through those games without paying attention, because I want to play with fluidity and with elegance. But I don't know enough about the game to have either of those things. It reminds me of something that a composition professor told me when I first started graduate study. And my work was weak in a lot of ways, but he said something that sticks with me. He said that your work needs work. Your work is raw or not complete in certain ways. But that doesn't mean that you, as a composer, have those flaws. It's a craft. So that distinction between the quality of the mind against the quality of the practice is very useful when faced with something that is otherwise unfathomable. So I take those. I want to play with the way that I'm comfortable, like playing music, where I've got 30 years of playing piano. I'm very comfortable sitting down, and sometimes I'm meticulous in practice, but quite often I sit and I just play. I improvise or I play through music I'm very familiar with. I want to play Go with that same sense, but I don't have 30 years of playing Go experience. I've got 30 days of really thinking about it, years of irresponsibly not playing Go. And now I'm trying to remedy that. So these games that I play, I try to be alert. I try to keep my wits about me and not let the frustration of playing poorly make me give up. I guess that's all I'm saying. So I'll take a game that I've played online and then recreate it on the board. And that act alone seems to be central to my ability to really absorb the information. Watching a lecture, doing exercises on my phone, playing a game online is exciting and engaging. But the physicality of moving the stones on the board, even if I'm not necessarily studying each move, although I do try to play through some variations to make sure I understand why certain things happened. And if not understand them, at least convince myself that what I did was actually stupid. but it was a mistake, that I wasn't paying attention. So that physicality, which is very much like the physicality of writing by hand, even if I'm just copying out, which I do in the morning sometimes as part of a morning routine, is just take a piece of paper, take a nice pen, and write a paragraph or a poem, just write it out, the act of writing, the haptic of writing, the haptic of placing the stone on the board is as important as studying. So the game of Go, I just got a collection of Joseki. Joseki are standard patterns. I think there's hundreds, maybe thousands of them. But I have a book of 38 standard. They're like openings in chess, where there's a set of assumed moves that generally works out well for both players. If both players know the move, there can be an agreement that you're going to go through this or that Joseki. But what it also does is show what good form looks like on the board. So even if you aren't following through the particular Joseki in a particular instance, through absorption, through osmosis, this idea of what are the kind of moves that make sense in particular common scenarios, what are they? This also plays well with how I think I learn. I remember when I was younger doing Kung Fu, we learned forms. Before we did free-form sparring, we learned forms. Long forms that you memorized the move and then you worked diligently at executing those forms well, even though they were choreographed and, in a sense, useless in any kind of free-form sparring. But they were essential to train the muscles. They were essential to build a sense of how the different strikes or kicks or movement worked with different combinations, like Joseki, like practicing scales at the piano. If that's all you do, and that is so in Kung Fu, there's performance where all you do is the forms, as opposed to different schools where once you get to a certain point, it becomes more focused on sparring and freeform. So the Joseki are like those forms, and I think perhaps because of my experience with practicing piano, where I'm very comfortable taking a section and breaking it down into small components and repeating them, and first building up muscle memory and then getting beyond muscle memory and then trying to put it together with the next section. This appeals to me. This memorization of 38 Joseki. So that will be part of my morning study now, is 20 minutes a day, play the first stone, play the second stone. Do I remember the third stone? If I don't, look it up. Until I get to the point where for each Joseki I can play through the dozen or so moves that are associated with it, check that off, go to the next one. So getting over that hump, getting into the state, you can see where this is going into kind of a language of spontaneity, skillful action, skillful means. What is the correct or the most appropriate response to a particular moment? How can you act with spontaneity that isn't formless, right? Because I think that's the risk. If you jump right to a place where you say, I don't need to meditate because I'm going to leave things as they are. If the work of removing attachment is still to be done, then leaving things as they are means that my karma and my attachments and my illusions and my deceptions and my sort of unclear perception colors what it is. What it is those delusions. It isn't as it really is, or rather, as it really is the delusion. So there's work to be done before you can make the kind of big sky, clear mind statements like leave it be, spontaneous, be here now. There's work to be done to memorize Joseki. There are scales to be practiced. There's essays to be read about Heidegger. There's technical components to understand about modulus synthesis. But this is all leading up to kind of this resolute understanding of expression. And as I was thinking about how I'm going to proceed with my essays, where I've had success before, and I'm thinking in particular of the exegesis on 35 sentences, which will form part of this collection. I talked about it in a podcast 4 or 5 ago. Those were relatively short. They were certainly time-bound reactions to material that existed. Notes, in the exegesis, it was sentences written by Solowit. But I've had similar success where I've taken my own old notes that I'm trying to turn into a long essay. But if I instead of thinking about a large framework, if I think, here's a statement. It's a statement that someone different wrote. I wrote it, but it was previous me. What does current me think to respond to that? And there is a response. And within the 1,000 words, 1,500 words, I can respond spontaneously to that comment. And then that is often material that plugs right into the finished work. So that spontaneous statement in Buddhism is a Vajra song, Vajra, a Vajra song. It's a spontaneous song of enlightenment. It is an expression of an experience. It can be a specific teaching. But the idea that the teacher explodes in this outpouring of Vajra song, wisdom song, and these are then written down and studied, recited, and at a certain point, it's part of the tantric tradition. At a certain point, when the energy is there and the transformation is there, recite your own Vajra. I don't know if this next part is correct, but in my mind, there's a connection between the Vajra song and then sort of the tradition of final words, when the master recognizes that their own death is upon them. The words that they speak are profound and important. And so in my mind, the Vajra song has that same weight, because the moment is dead. This present moment is not any longer. Do you know what I mean? But in that is this glory and this evanescence of meaning that can be stated in a Vajra song. Okay, so my scrappy notes are not Vajra songs. They are not explosions of experience and wisdom. But what they are is my statement of what it is now. And that is everything I said before, that the delusions, the fantasies, the hopes, the desires, this sort of poetic halo. And if I could think of a way to do this, I would title these so that this idea of the poetic halo came through. Because when I say the nature of imagination as a potential title, what I really mean is this element of being human, this aspect of being human that is transformed by or in the imagination. And each of the essays comes at this through music or through a poem or through memory. What if, on my train ride out to New York, alternating with readings in Heidegger, I take as a prompt a statement where I know that things need to be worked out structurally in the essay, looking for an elegant turn to the material. If I approach each of those as a prompt for a time-bound exploration of what it is right now in reaction to that statement, and then piece these all together, and that's what the essays will be. this shit is important. I've written this note to myself when I put down the notes to what I was going to talk about today. I said, how would I summarize this? 2 things, 3 things. Keep my wits about me, which is part of the dry trump. This shit is important. Art is life. And that is an important part of what I'm trying to write here, is that the stuff we think of as art often can be held distant, and it can't be. It has to be absorbed directly in. It has to, our life has to shape around it as structures. A good poem, meaning a poem that means something to you, to me, is like a Joseki, except it's a Joseki between you, between me, and the universe. You know, when I first started reading Auden and Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, it was a summer when I was at home recovering from some surgery, and I was looking for things that said something like what I was feeling, and I didn't know what I was feeling, except I felt reduced, and so I was looking for poems that were physical, physiological. I'm sure that's why I was first drawn to Sylvia Plath, that like with Heidegger, death is a presence that she confronts, and she confronts it in her poetic, idiosyncratic way, the way that Heidegger confronted it with his theological, philosophical way, to confrontation with mortality, either an acceptance, a rejection, or back and forth. But it's a dialogue, and it's a framework, like Joseki, like scales, like study. Just to close down, there were a couple of questions that I've gotten lately, and again, thank you for people who listen and respond. And I am trying to increase the audience, both here and on the YouTube channel. But one of the questions that I've gotten is, what's the bump music, the bit that comes between stuff at the start and the end? And I'm going to put a link to one of my Bandcamp albums, because it's actually, a couple of things. First, it's based on a recording of me playing piano. I'm actually playing just a couple of measures from a piece by Jean-Philippe Rameau, and I was then also applied a similar technique to the phase shift process that Steve Reich used in some of his early pieces, like clapping music, or before that, even the very first the tape pieces he did, where he would have a recorded sample, and then the physical tape ran through 2 different tape players, and they were each slightly off. So then when it ran back in, you overlaid this very slight shift, and over the course of 20 minutes or so, that built up into this enormous wave of sound. And to get there, it would get to a point where there was just an offset, or kind of a counterpoint between 2 different versions of the same thing. Pieces like "Come Out and Show Them," "It's Gonna Rain," those are the 2 that I think of. Anyway, I started trying to think how to recreate that without using old 8-track or whatever reel-to-reel technology. And that piece is one of those. The album has a couple of different techniques that I use to try and recreate that. So this particular Rameau piece that I'll link to is very long, and I think it's quite successful, but I particularly liked this little section. I wanted something that was, I think it's 10 seconds, 15 seconds. That's probably a little bit too long for what I want in a podcast, but I've gotten used to it now. So it's a phase shifted recording of a section of a piece that I put together for Rameau. I think I called it Misremembered Rameau. Misremembered Rameau? Anyway, I'll put a link in the show notes, and then again on zenglop.net there's a link to my music downloads. There's a bunch of stuff there that you're welcome to go listen to and download at your leisure.